Hello everyone, this is Mr. Kaviani, and by the end of this video, you should be able to define the concept of center of mass and calculate the center of mass of a system of bodies in one dimension. To begin discussing center of mass, I'd like you to take a moment and think about the observations you made from our experiment balancing masses on a meter stick fixed at its center. Now, when you were trying to balance two masses of different mass, you may have noticed that they had to be certain distances apart from the center in order to balance. And so as you did different trials of this experiment, maybe you noticed something like, let's see if mass 2 here were, this diagram is not to scale, right? So maybe mass 2 was 100 grams, then it had to be, I don't know, maybe 10 centimeters away. In order to balance, if this mass was 50 grams, so if it was half the mass, it would have to be twice the distance. That might have been an observation that you made. And as you repeated this several times, you may have come up with the observation that if I were to multiply the mass by the distance on both sides, they should be equal in order for the meter stick to balance or to not rotate. So many of you, I noticed, came up with a relationship something like this. If I multiply the first mass by its distance from the center, R1, that should be equal to the second mass and its distance from the center, M2 and R2. And so in trial after trial, you hopefully observed that this pattern continued to appear, right? The product of any mass and its distance from the center on both sides had to be equal. We can take this a step further, and let's say we wanted a formula to actually give us the value of that center point, right? So in this case, we're going to call this like 0. This is like our origin, and we measured all the distances from that 0 origin point. But what if we wanted an equation that actually told us where that origin was? What if, for example, this system were not balanced? Where would that balancing point need to be? Let's see if we can derive an equation for that. And so I'll begin with the equation that we observed in class, that mass 1 multiplied by its distance from the center will be equal to the second mass and its distance from the center. All right. Now I'm going to define R1 and R2 in terms of their distance from the origin. And so hopefully we can agree. If we're going to call, let's say that this mass is actually at a position of x1. So this is like, if you imagine this were a number line, that would be the actual number on the meter stick where the mass was being hung. And then let's say that this mass would be at the actual position of x2, okay? So hopefully you see that this distance is nothing more than, if I call this center point here, we'll call that x with a bar on top. That'll be like the balancing. This will be my balancing point, okay? This distance from the center is really just like saying take the balancing point and subtract from it x1. And so we'll say that r1 will be equal to, right, that x bar minus x1. And hopefully this makes sense, right? In our experiment, x bar was 50 centimeters, right? That's where the meter stick was balanced in every case. And so if you think about it, if the meter stick read, if x1 said 20 centimeters, right, then what would the distance from the center be? Well, you wrote that down as, right, 50 minus 20, that would be 30 centimeters. So that would be the distance you would say from the center. So x bar minus x1 is just a more explicit way of writing this distance that you did in the lab. So then similarly, R2, since R2 is on the right side of the balancing point, we'll say that R2 here, I'll do this to the side, R2 is going to be x2 minus x bar. And that what that's saying is if you take that longer position and subtract from it the center point, you'll get the distance from the center point. So in this example, let's again say that, x2 was, I don't know, maybe 70 centimeters, and x bar was, again, 50 centimeters, because that's where we attached the meter stick. So then that distance would be maybe, x2 minus x bar would be 20 centimeters, and that's the distance that you wrote down on your in your lab document. So these are just different ways of expressing the same things that you were doing already. So we'll just say that m1 times that x bar minus x1 will be equal to mass 2 times the second position minus that, again, that midpoint position. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get an equation for x bar. I want to be able to immediately determine where that balancing point is, and then I could just move the whole meter stick to that balancing point. So I'm going to rearrange for x bar right now. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to distribute the m1 and m2 to both sides of the equation. So I'll just go ahead and multiply everything out together, and this will be what it looks like. All right, so now that I've distributed those terms outside of the parentheses, I am going to move all of the terms with x bar onto the left side of the equation and the other terms without x bar onto the right side of the equation. All right, so if I go ahead and just move those terms over, I'm going to move the m2x to the right side, so I'll add on both sides and move that m1x1 term to the right side, and again, add both sides because it's negative on the left. That will give me this expression. Now, because all of the terms containing x bar are on the left side of this equation, I can factor out x bar, and then we'll see what I have. All right, now I can divide by that m1 plus m2 term because it's the coefficient of x bar. If I divide both sides of the equation by that coefficient, I'll get an equation with x bar by itself. All right, and that leaves us with the final expression that the balancing point will be equal to the sum of the products of each mass and their distance from the center, and then that m1, m2, the total mass of the system. And so this is our center of mass equation, essentially. This x bar is our center of mass, or the balancing point. Essentially, this tells us where we have to put the meter stick in order to balance the system. So we can also write this, you'll see this sometimes written as, instead of x bar, as an x with a little cm for center of mass. And what this is, it's just like a weighted average. If I multiply each mass, this should be x2 here. So if I multiply each mass, if I take the second mass and multiply it by its position, and then I add it to the first mass and multiply by its position, and then just divide all of those masses by the total mass of the system, that will tell me where the average mass is essentially, or the center of mass. So if you've ever done a weighted average, like a grade book weighted average, this is exactly the same idea. It's a weighted average, but it tells us where the average mass, or the center of mass that we're going to say, is in our system. And for every single balance that you did in this experiment, your center of mass was at 50 centimeters, the 50 centimeter position on the meter stick. And so now we have an equation that could help us calculate the center of mass very easily if we know the masses that are being used and the positions that they are from whatever point we define to be the origin. And so just to take a moment now to define center of mass, since we're more familiar with it, it can be thought of as the point in a body, or in the case of the meter stick and the masses, those were many bodies thought together as a system, at which the whole mass may be considered as a single point, right? So we can essentially consolidate all of the mass of the meter stick and the two masses into just a single point at the center. And sometimes it's also called the center of gravity. And so if you see that term used, center of gravity, that's talking about the same thing in a uniform or continuous field of gravity like we have here on Earth. Now, it's kind of interesting to think about the idea that, the center of mass may not actually be part of the object. So, for example, on the image to the right, you see that this, like a stock pot, right, that a chef would use. If you were to think about the average mass of that stock pot, it's actually not anywhere on the stock pot itself, but it's in the center, like in the air, where of the center of the pot. That's where the center of its mass would be. If you think about this rocking chair, it's actually somewhere underneath the chair. A teacup would be inside the teacup, and a boomerang is actually in that empty space right between the sort of the U part of the boomerang. And so the center of mass doesn't actually have to be part of the object at all. It's really just sort of like a hypothetical, or like an imaginary point where we can consider all of the mass to be concentrated. So it may not actually be where we're going to say the geometric center of the object would be, which is a bit strange sometimes. So the geometric center is just talking about, where the actual middle point of that object would be. If you look at the shape of that object, it might not actually be there, depending on how the mass is distributed in that object. So this can be calculated for irregular or amorphous shapes using calculus. We're actually not going to be able to calculate the center of mass for very irregular shapes like a stock pot or a rocking chair without using something like calculus, which you can look at in more advanced physics courses. So this is our equation for what we're only going to do one-dimensional center of mass in this class. And this center of mass equation hopefully looks familiar to the one we just derived. However, it's been made more generic because if you have 10 or 100 or 1,000 masses, it works the same way. you just take the mass, each mass, and multiply it by the position of that mass. And you'll do that for all of them. Let's say you had for n masses, right? If n is just some number, a placeholder, if you will. You would add them all up, all of the products of their mass and distances. And then you would do that over all of the masses added together. So m1 plus m2 plus all the way till you get to the nth mass. Add up all the masses. That will give you the position of the center of mass. So this is the position. Remember x we use as position of the center of mass. And in a moment, we'll solve an example problem, and you'll see that this is the position from some origin. It doesn't really matter where you define the origin. It just matters that you're consistent. So let's take a look at calculating the center of mass for a one-dimensional system using this equation.